Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Night Live. My name's David Mintz. I'm from Shrewsbury Shul. Sunday Night Live is a program that we run every week on a Sunday night at 8 p.m., where we cover the subjects that are most important to you. This evening, we're very grateful. Our broadcast is being shared by the Board of Deputies. But it's also going out to all the most of the shuls in North Manchester, so Holy Law, Steam Court, Mead Hill, Heaton Park, and Whitefield are sharing the broadcast with us this evening. So welcome to anybody that is watching and listening. I'm aware also that a few people have tuned in from abroad. This evening, I am joined by Paul Harris, editor of the Jewish Telegraph, and Adam Cailler, reporter at the Jewish Telegraph, and tonight we're going to try and get to the to the heart of the matter, covering the independent Jewish news source that we're very lucky to have on our doorstep. Before we get into that, we're going to try and dissect many sort of issues surrounding the media. And if anybody wants a cuddlier version of this interview, Johnny Gould, who does some fantastic work, has a podcast which I encourage you all to check out. I think it's called Johnny Gould's Jewish State, if I'm not mistaken. And there is a very lovely interview there with Paul, where they cover many aspects of the 70-year history of the Jewish Telegraph, and some very interesting, light-hearted stories there from Paul. A little bit of it's just very amusing, and it's very sweet. So everybody should definitely check that out. Paul, good evening. Welcome to the show. Can we hear you?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can hear you now. I can hear you. Thank you for joining us. 70 years is an awful long time for any publication, but one that has remained in the Harris family hands pretty much since its inception. Did you envisage being in this position now?
Well, it's not pretty much since its inception. It's since its inception, because my parents actually founded the Jewish Telegraph in their Vine Street, Salford dining room with a borrowed typewriter and £50 capital. So of those 70 years, I will actually celebrate 51 with the Telegraph in January, which is some landmark, and I've been editor since 1979. So that's quite a time.
Wow, that is an awful long period of time, and a lot of things have changed during that time. And one of them is obvious. I think in any discussion that involves printed press, the elephant in the room is always the fact that the younger generation is expecting a web-ready version of their newspaper, which I know that the Telegraph has gone out of their way. You provide an e-version of your newspaper that can be downloaded to people that are subscribing. But I would imagine as well, Adam, this is probably more your forte, because I know you run the online side of things. It's also given rise to a new method of critique, which is, fondly referred to as trolls. So we live in a day and age where feedback to your average news article is pretty much instant, isn't it?
Yeah. Anything we post on Facebook or Twitter within the first 5 minutes of it being there will have instant feedback, whether it be good or bad. Thankfully, most of what we post online gets pretty good responses, but there's always the odd troll that we kind of have to deal with. But in the main, we don't have that many trolls or negativity towards the paper online, thankfully.
And it's something that when you do, you need to sort of be able to respond to that pretty much instantly before it gets out of control.
Yeah, between me and Paul's son Alex, there's always somebody monitoring social media to make sure that there is nothing left on there that really shouldn't be left on there.
So, but back in the day, Paul, you would have had similar feedback, but I take it was all via letters and the telephone.
Well, I think it's also worth adding at this point that 25 years ago, virtually, when we actually launched a website, and it's not changed since then and looks it. We made a conscious decision that we were not going to post all our material online. I mean, that was deliberate. And so many newspapers, Jewish, national, evening newspapers, a lot, made a huge mistake of posting all their material online. And some of them still do that. As a result, they just lost their circulation completely because people no longer had the need to buy those newspapers. They could get it all free online. We retained our circulation by putting very, very, very little on our website. And now we've cut that down even further with just a few paragraphs, a few stories from each of our 4 editions, so that people are then directed to go to our e-edition, which they can subscribe to behind a paywall. Yes, we used to get letters. That was the only way people could communicate. And I suppose the one good thing is that we receive letters from all over the world, people who actually do read the correspondence columns online. And that gives an added dimension. That's one of the things we actually do put online.
Well, let's talk a little bit about finances, because running any business during COVID has been extremely challenging, no more so than for the local press. But the challenge of running a local newspaper, that financial challenge has existed far before COVID even reared its head.
Yeah, it's frightening. Just fast forwarding to COVID, in March, I wondered whether we would actually survive into April. It was so bad. We lost 75% of our advertising revenue, literally for Pesach as it was approaching and ongoing. And this has continued. We've had new streams of advertising, but we've lost a lot of our, virtually all our restaurant advertising. We've lost all our travel advertising and your business as well. We've lost a lot of the property advertising that we were getting. It has been a miracle over 70 years that we've survived, a real miracle. And there have been some very hairy moments. And you have to remember that we are the only non-subsidized Jewish newspaper in this country. So we're subsidized in no way whatsoever by benefactors or from abroad. We have to live or fall on our own finances, and that is through advertising revenue, which was a bit galling. Earlier this year, during the summer, we needed to get some revenue, and we put up the cover price of the paper, which had remained at the same level of 60p since, well, for 14 years. We put it up fairly steeply to 95p, which is very, very cheap. It's less than a bar of chocolate, the cost of a bar of chocolate. But there was a backlash from some quarters. How dare we? People are going to cancel the paper. I have to say that has not shown in circulation. We even had one reader in Scotland, our Glasgow edition, who informed us quite openly that in future they were going to go to Morrison's and read the paper rather than buy it.
Fair enough. That's a bit extreme. I'm not sure it's going to drive me to Morrison's quite yet. But let's have a look at that, because whoever holds the finances really sort of holds the front page in some circles. The media has become something that a bit of a political plaything. If we look at the advent of fake news, as it's become known over the past 4 or 5 years, it's nothing new. There were men like Richard Nixon that had views on the power that the media held. Similarly, people like Donald Trump hold those ideas as well. But there is some truth to that whoever is behind that newspaper is able to put out their message. Is that true?
Yes, it's true. But we're very careful, as Adam will attest. I mean, we go through things very, very carefully before they appear. And if any of the staff disagree with what's appearing on the front page or how it's headlined, I'm always more than willing to listen to other views, and also willing to listen to a younger viewpoint sometimes. We don't always get it right. I would say 99% of the time we do, but we would never deliberately post fake news or write fake news. The sort of complaints we get, though, are unusual. A week last Friday's paper, we highlighted on the front page a survey carried out by Work Avenue. the organization which helps individual Jewish people and Jewish businesses which have hit problems. And their survey showed that 75% of Jewish people in this country had been adversely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We actually got complaints, believe it or not, and quite abusive complaints that we dared to highlight that in headlines on the front page. Conversely, Work Avenue thanked us for doing so. And all this did was really to highlight the fact that Jewish people are not all wealthy, as a lot of people seem to think. And the complainants thought that we would attract anti-Semitism by running that on the front page. Quite the opposite, in fact. It shows that not all Jews are wealthy, and Jewish people, like anybody else, are struggling during the pandemic. And 75% of people, which is a hell of a lot, have been adversely impacted.
But the reason for that, Paul, is that some people, I mean, perhaps rather naively, but we all assume that the Jewish Telegraph, to take it in its probably least journalistic form, is there to inform us about who, hatched, matched, and dispatched. That's the page that everybody gravitates to see who's still around, who's with us, who's arrived, who's getting together. That was very much the sweet version of the JT. But you've also got other people that think that in addition to that sort of stuff that we all want to read, we'll all check into that, but that you are somehow responsible by proxy for the reputational management of our community, that what you print on your front page and what you print in your letters section gives a non-Jewish observer a window into our lives and into our communities, and therefore if you don't print positive stuff, then they're going to walk away seeing the other side of things.
Well, that was positive as far as I was concerned. And as I mentioned in my leader column last Friday, we get complaints when we run results from CST reports, where the CST sometimes highlights Islamic fundamentalism being responsible for some forms of anti-Semitism. And I can't tell you how many complaints we've had over the years for daring to highlight that, because the complainant news agents who were maybe Muslim would be offended by it. I think it's quite the contrary. They've been more offended by miscreants in their own community who actually foment anti-Semitism. But we also have to, as a Jewish newspaper and as a Jewish newspaper editor, have to impose some self-imposed censorship. There are things we wouldn't publish and don't publish. We should probably, and we get criticized for not doing. Mostly we don't carry court reports. We don't report when Jewish people get into trouble in this way, unlike some sections of the Jewish media. We see no real reason to. It would be different if a Jewish husband murdered his Jewish wife and was in court. We probably would report that. But if it were not that case, we wouldn't. If a Jewish businessman is jailed or in court for embezzlement or for some other misdemeanor, we wouldn't report that per se, but we would report, and we have reported, if a shul administrator embezzles funds from the synagogue and is in court for that. And we would certainly report, and we have reported, when there have been miscreants involved with Jewish charities and have been jailed for stealing money from them. That's a different matter. I think we have to eradicate sometimes the mystique around the Jewish community, that somehow we're different. We're the same as any other community. And as Ben-Gurion said when he became the first prime minister of Israel, Israel will be a proper nation when it's got thieves, prostitutes, etc. And I think we have to reflect the community as it really is, tastefully. But if people are doing wrong, we have to report that. We can't just report all the nice things. We have to report things warts and all sometimes.
Well, so therein lies the conflict. See, you guys are fiercely independent and proudly independent, but you are also reliant on advertising revenue. Where is I'd imagine it's a rather awkward conversation if you've got very large advertisers who are trying to put pressure on you to withdraw certain headlines or suppress certain stories. the Manchester Jewish community, you're quite right, is no different to any other community all over the world. The power sometimes is invested in certain organizations or individuals who would seek to put pressure on the media in order to stop certain things coming to the fore. And in many ways, people like me, members of the public, we rely on guys like you to keep us honest, because the threat of you being able to uncover a story is really what keeps people on their toes. But there's got to be a conflict there when it comes to advertising revenues.
You're absolutely right. It doesn't happen frequently, but it does happen where we get threats from advertisers who may possibly be involved in common organizations as well, threatening to withdraw their advertising if we run such and such a story. The most interesting one probably was when I became the first Jewish journalist in the world to meet and interview Yasser Arafat. And we ran a story on the front page. There was a picture of me shaking hands with Arafat on the front page. There's some people who still fairly prominent in the Manchester Jewish community who threatened that they would never advertise with us again and were withdrawing their advertising. 6 months or 9 months later, when Israel started talking officially to the Palestinians, I have to say I did contact a couple of those people and say, does this mean you're no longer with Israel? I don't think they really saw the immutable side of that. But it is true, people do try to bring pressure on us, and it doesn't work, I have to say. We have lost advertising occasionally in the past because we will not withhold a story under threat and blackmail. I'm not going to mention any names or organizations, but as short a time ago as our Rosh Hashanah edition in September, a prominent Manchester Jewish organization had an expensive wraparound which was scheduled to appear. They tried to blackmail us that week. Unless we ran a particular story about that organization on the front page, they would not produce the artwork for it until they got the guarantee. We actually pulled the advert at the last minute, and I think that rather surprised them. So maybe that was a little window into what actually happened.
And I'd imagine that's something that can happen quite frequently over the years on more than one occasion. So, Adam, when you're reporting on a story, and in fact, I'm not going to mention any particular incidents or any particular stories, because some of these things can sort of act as a trigger for some people with unpleasant memories. But you get to cover the good side of things, but you also get to cover some rather unpleasant stories that happen in day-to-day life. But you're tasked with taking a certain ethical stance, really, in the tone of your articles and the ethical line that your newspaper is taking. Every newspaper has one. You may wish to call it an agenda, but it's less cynical than that. It's not a driven agenda, but it's really an ethical line that you guys take. And I've seen you come under pressure to change that or to withdraw certain stories. This isn't anything to do with big organizations. These can just be individuals. So to what extent does it make your job that much harder when you're uncovering a story?
I can count on maybe two fingers the amount of times we've not run a story because someone's told us not to run it. One of which was the Rosh Hashanah story that Paul just mentioned, but again, we won't go into it. 99% of the time, if a story is worth reporting on, we report on it, regardless of the consequences. Because at the end of the day, we're a newspaper. We're not a community magazine. We're not, something that's there just to report on an event that someone spoke at. We're a newspaper. So if a story is worth reporting on and worth digging into, no matter how many people say, how dare you report on it, or please don't report on it, we'll still report on it because that's what a newspaper does.
And I suppose we are reliant on the Jewish Telegraph to speak up for us on a regional basis as well, because the other news sources that tend to exist out there are not necessarily focused on northern communities as you guys tend to be, although I do know you've got a wider reach these days. But if you were to read mainstream Jewish press from London, and this is an ongoing debate. I've heard this said about the Board of Deputies as well, and any kind of Jewish organisation that is more centred to London, that politics and news tends to have a very London-centric focus, and so we're really reliant on the Telegraph to speak up for us down here.
That's right. It's very, very important that what we do is running 4 separate editions of the paper in Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, and Glasgow. We make no apologies for publishing Parish Pump. At the moment, obviously, there are no coffee mornings, but we've always given publicity to women's organisations' coffee mornings. It doesn't matter if there's a bit of trivia in the paper, whether that be Hanukkah pictures or Purim pictures or a model Seder. This is what people want to see. And very recently, we've been running quite a bit of nostalgia in the paper, old pictures. This started for other reasons at one stage, but now it's become a very popular feature and people respond to that. My father, when he started the paper, was always insistent that the paper published local news. So it'll always be local news first if there's a good local news story for the front page, followed by regional news, national news, or international news. If there's a good local story, it will take priority over all else, without any doubt at all. And as you say, that's important. We have to reflect what happens in the community, because I like to think that myself and my staff have our finger on the pulse of the community and actually understand what the community is all about. It's ever changing. From when I first started in the paper, the Broughton Park area, for instance, Leicester Road was always an ultra-Orthodox area, Northumberland Street was. But you have literally a handful of Haredim now. Of course, there's a huge number in Manchester, and Manchester is the largest growing community in Europe.
So what would you say to those that would accuse you of having an anti-Orthodox bias in the paper? Because I know this is something that's come up before. You've had complaints from members of the Orthodox community in terms of the way that they're portrayed. When I say that section of the community, and one of the beauties of our community is that we have all sorts of strand of modern Jewish life there. The bit that tends to be squeezed at the moment is what I would call that middle, which is a lot of the communities that we're talking to tonight. A lot of those sort of shuls are feeling the squeeze, but the Orthodox community doesn't always see eye to eye with you.
No, not at all, and that's through no fault of our own. Some years ago, about 15 years ago, this is the perfect example of why they think that what they call from bashing by the Telegraph, which is absolutely nonsensical. About 15 years ago, we launched a publication called Erev Shabbos, which was a free newspaper distributed among the ultra-Orthodox community of Manchester. Certain Dayanim in Manchester and Rabbonim preached against it and threatened all sorts of repercussions if their Stiebel members, their shul members, read the paper or advertised in it. One of those, and I can mention the name now because it all changed, was the late Diane Westheim. And Diane Westheim was one of the people who told people not to advertise in it, not to read it. I made an appointment to see Diane Westheim and asked him why. He said, because you're anti-Frum. And I had 2 witnesses there with me who would vouch for this conversation. And I said, why do you think we're anti-Frum? He said, people say so. I said, have you actually ever read the Jewish Telegraph? He said, no. I said, then why do you think we're anti-Frum? And I produced papers, explained it to him. He changed his stance completely, and thereafter we spoke quite frequently. And this is very typical. There is one store in Manchester which decided it would no longer stock the Jewish Telegraph because its readers, quote, were unhappy with some of our content about the ultra-Orthodox community. When I said, well, what do you mean by unhappy? They couldn't really elucidate it all. But what they actually meant, I said, you mean they don't like the fact we report the truth sometimes? So, in other words, if, for instance, there is a riot in an area of Israel where ambulances are stoned because they're driving on Shabbos or police cars, and we report that. That is considered to be anti-Frum. We're anything but anti-Frum. We're not an ultra-Orthodox paper, but our policy is to support orthodoxy and to support the Orthodox community. You know, we've so often written leaders' comment pieces praising schools like Masifta for its standards and what it does, and King David's School, the more Orthodox streams. It's quite the opposite. We go out of our way at Pesach to ensure that we feature the Bells community and matzah baking and things like this. We're anything but anti-Orthodox. I would love anybody actually to produce one single example of where the Jewish Telegraph has published anything which is anti-Orthodox in the last 20 years.
Are we going to see an Orthodox reporter at the Telegraph then?
We have one called Doreen.
Doreen Watchman.
Doreen's been in the game a long, long time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just to jump in a sec.
Yeah.
We only ever get called anti-Orthodox if we do one negative story about the Orthodox community, yet we run hundreds of positives. The same when we do a negative story about liberal Judaism, we're suddenly negative, anti-liberal or anti-reform. Every community says the same thing. If we do one negative article about that community, 99 times out of 100, we're doing positive stories about those communities. So you can't really win.
I guess an answer,
story which is not apocryphal. This is 100% true, and this occurred about 25 or 30 years ago, when on a Friday morning I received a telephone call from Manchester Reformed Synagogue, from its minister at the time, accusing us of being anti-reform. That same day, I received a call from a member of the ultra-Orthodox community telling us we were anti-Orthodox. So I knew we were doing something right at that point.
It's what you call balanced journalism. As long as you're offending everybody equally, you're going to be okay. But to go back to that question then, it's probably in the Manchester Jewish community has grown so much. And the last census, I think, was done 2011. We're expecting another one next year if they can actually get out there to do it. But we're going to show massive figures of growth, particularly amongst the ultra-Orthodox. We may find the other sides of the community contracting, and therein lies a story in itself. But I suppose in this day and age, with the growth of the Orthodox community at the rate that it's going, it's almost impossible for one newspaper to be representative of a whole community.
The thing is that the Haredi community, the real Haredi community, they don't tend to read newspapers at all. Interestingly, we have a fair smattering of readers among the Haredi community. At one stage, they weren't reading the paper, and this was because the only newsagent which really served them in their own area, in Leicester Road, Northumberland Street, etc., they didn't want to be seen buying the paper there. And funnily enough, I did some really unscientific market research accidentally one Motzei Shabbos, and it was at the filling station right next to the shrubberies. I was in there filling up, and a Chassid went over to the magazine stand. He picked up a girly magazine, just put it under his coat so it couldn't be seen, went up to the cashier, looked around and paid for it and went out. And I thought, right, this is the answer. We put the Telegraph into the petrol stations and we put it into the supermarket. So we started by putting 50 copies of the Telegraph into the filling station that was next door to our office. Told the manager there, take 50 copies, keep the proceeds this week, just tell me who buys it. And I was spot on. It was members of the ultra-Orthodox community who were picking it up with their petrol there. So it was interesting because we'll often get a call on a Friday morning, somebody from the Haredi community say, I wouldn't buy your paper, I wouldn't read it. But on page 32 at the bottom, why did you write blah, blah, blah? Touche.
Okay, fair enough. But they also they have their own newspapers, as it were, their own sources. So there are newspapers out there, the Hamadir, for instance, which has a very different viewpoint and a very different ethical viewpoint as well. They have certain standards that they adhere to that are very, very peculiar to that particular niche of journalism. So, for instance, they won't print a picture of a lady, any lady, in the newspaper. And imagine reporting on politics whilst Theresa May was Prime Minister would have been challenging at the best of times. But that's a different type of reporting, and they're free to go and get their news there as well, Paul.
When we were running our paper Erev Shabbos, we did exactly the same. We ran no pictures of women. We ran wedding pictures showing the groom only, believe it or not. We only ever referred to Israel as Eretz Yisrael, and we kept people happy doing that. But a lot of the Haredi community, a vast proportion, will not buy any newspaper, whether it's Hamadiyya or anything else. They really, honestly, don't want to know anything that's going on outside their own community, their own little community. It's as simple as that. Some of them will buy it, but a lot of them will not.
We've got a comment coming in, which probably nicely takes us to our next point. But Robert Nathan, good evening, Robert. Thanks for joining us. When you receive a tip-off for a news story, what stages will you go through before considering going with the story itself? So I guess what I wanted to discuss with you guys, and you can answer this question in answer to my question, is at what point does local gossip, salacious rumors and gossip, become news that is clearly in the public interest?
It never gets in the gossip never gets into the paper, salacious gossip or any other gossip, and as Adam will attest, unless it's checked thoroughly. We get so many tip-offs about stories every single week, every single day. A lot of them are completely nonsensical. Some of these are posted on social media. Some of them are phoned in to us. Some of them prove to be very good stories, but we don't publish unless we're 100% sure that what we're receiving is accurate. And I think 99% of the time we get it right.
And anything that's super serious tends to go through Paul before it comes to us. There are things that Paul knows that he won't even tell us because he wants to check them out first before we report on it. But things that are in the main harmless, it only takes 1 or 2 phone calls to figure out whether it's true or whether it's not. It's just the basis of good journalism, really.
And when we talk about public interest, obviously there's a higher ideal there of serving the public interest and speaking truth to power and all those things. But very often on a local level, sometimes public interest will just be the things that interest the members of the public locally, right?
That's because there are 2 different things there. There is public interest and things that are of interest to the public, and they're very, very different. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. Quite some years ago, we uncovered a major security breach at a Jewish school in Manchester. This was brought to our attention and we checked it out. We would never publish that. And we took this information to the school at the time and told them, and that never appeared in print. It would have been far, far too dangerous. I'll give an even better example. On the day after the day that Princess Diana died, I was at a health club and I was sitting by the pool. I actually bought I think it was 5 or 6 editions of the News of the World that had been published throughout the night and updated with the various information as it was coming in. Somebody I know came to sit by me, and he said, "This is dreadful, absolutely dreadful. What they're doing to what they've done to Princess Diana, absolute rubbish. Can I have a look at that, please?" And then proceeded to read it. And it's rather the same, I think. If there's a plane crash, if there is a terror incident, unfortunately, people will read and read and read every last detail that's published in the national press about this. That is of public interest, and whether it's always in the interest. This is of public interest, whether it actually is something which should actually appear in print. Very often, all the salacious details is another matter, but people do revel in it, unfortunately.
So you mentioned a title there, which was a sort of a victim of too much salacious gossip, and that was the News of the World, and the sort of methods that journalists working there had employed to garner news stories and the whole gamut of news gathering, which I know that you guys you do pride yourselves on. But let's face it, around the time of that Levinson inquiry, the media and the press came under some scrutiny. And that's quite a while ago now. And if we were to fast forward all these years on, I heard you, Paul, in an interview with the Board of Deputies a while ago. You said one of the biggest challenges that you guys have got, and also the Jewish media as a whole, is that to a certain extent you're self-regulating, aren't you?
Right.
And so it's up to Paul Harris then to decide what gets printed in his newspaper and what is fit for the public. But
it's quite a challenge, and it's quite worrying because it's a huge responsibility. It's not just deciding whether anything contentious is published, it's deciding at all times what is published and what is of interest to our readers. And you would find that our various editions, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool and Glasgow, they're all quite different. The communities like different types of news, they like different types of coverage. You mentioned the news of the world. What tends to be forgotten, yes, they crossed the line, phone tapping and other methods of, I won't even say news gathering, conning people into giving them information which wasn't necessarily even true. But over the years, the news of the world and people, as it used to be, exposed a lot of criminals and a lot of wrongdoing with some very, very good journalism, good reporting. You've got a paper like the Sunday Times, which is in the same stable, owned by Rupert Murdoch, with its insight team, which, among other things in the past, exposed the thalidomide scandal and many other things. So, there is no harm in this as long as it's done ethically and correctly. And there are times when newspapers can legitimately cross a boundary to gain information if that information is going to be in the public interest, but not just to publish salacious material which is untrue.
But I suppose the balance and the acid test to all of this is that if newspapers are printing stories for what the online community would refer to as clickbait, but really in order to sell newspapers, you need to print a certain type of story, because although a newspaper like the Daily Mail might not be my cup of tea, my grandmother used to love it because it sort of used to echo views held by people of that generation, which can sometimes be a little bit unhelpful as much as I loved her. But they hold a vision of England that perhaps no longer exists, but also it does actually cater to a crowd of individuals that's after a picture of a celebrity getting out of a car and having a wardrobe accident at the same time. It's all that sort of stuff. That's what
you'll find that more on the Daily Mail's website than in the paper itself. I mean, they publish multiple pictures of every event on their website, on their Facebook pages, etc., etc. But don't knock the Mail. I turn to the sports page on the Mail every day before I read anything else. It does a good job. But self-regulation is very difficult, and this is a problem. But you mention clickbait, as Adam again will confirm. We're very careful. So many newspapers, so many other media sources just literally retweet everything, repost everything on Facebook. Any rumor, you just have to be damn careful about this. People don't realize that the law of libel applies equally to what appears online as it does in a newspaper, and an individual, not a large news organization, can find themselves being sued for huge amounts if they post libelous material online. And people do, they share all sorts of nonsense. As soon as something appears, it's shared. You cannot do that because people just respond instantly to every rumor and take it as being true because it appears online. It doesn't. It's not the case. Even my own staff will sometimes say, if I question why we're publishing something, well, it's all over Google. You can't work that way at all because a lot of it is just absolute rubbish.
There's also a question of the integrity of the paper, because there are stories that we know of that we could quite easily put them on the front page. The community would think it's fantastic, and it wouldn't go amiss on the front of the Sun, as much as I hate the Sun. But we have to have respect for the community as well. And we wouldn't publish those kind of things out of respect for the community, to be honest.
And it's, I suppose it's a community that's treated you well over the years. Paul, if I could just go back to a rather interesting episode. So the story of how you got to meet Yasser Arafat, if anybody wants that full story, it is covered in great detail on Johnny Gould's show. But the way that you retold it, Paul, it was almost that Arafat was a very nuanced and practiced manipulator of people and the media, and he knew full well what he was doing when he was inviting you and your family. I mean, you had 2 young boys with you at the time that both got pictures taken having a cuddle with Uncle Yasser, which must have sent shivers down your spine at the time. But you can very easily find yourself in that situation. My question to you is that following the aftermath of that, there were all sorts of protests about that story. A lot of people said you should not have been in that situation. You certainly should not have put your family in that situation. And you were famously asked the question whether, if you were offered an interview with Adolf Hitler or similar, Saddam Hussein or etc., would you have taken the interview? And your answer to that was yes.
Absolutely yes. As a journalist, when I was asked at the time, and let me tell you, by the way, the main criticism was not that I interviewed Yasser Arafat. It was that I ran a picture of myself shaking hands on the front page. And honestly, when you are faced with somebody with automatic weapons by his side, you don't actually say no. When he extends his hand to you. Yes, of course I'd interview Yasser Arafat, Adolf Hitler or Saddam Hussein or anybody else if I had the opportunity. And, this wasn't an invitation from Yasser Arafat to be interviewed. I pushed for it. I happened to be in Tunisia. I made every effort to get the interview and eventually did. And it was surprising that I did so. It was a major exclusive. And why not? Why not hear what the enemy has to say? And I think that's what we were able to do. We were able to put over his viewpoint and maybe understand him a bit more. I mean, a lot of it was his propaganda, but it was a very interesting situation.
So when you say the enemy, obviously the Jewish Telegraph echoes the views of some of its readers, certainly, but has always taken a very strong Zionist standpoint. And I suppose being around for 70 years, you've covered most of the major conflicts and the building of the nascent state of Israel in its earlier days. So how do you maintain that Zionist point of view in an era where the word Zionism has become a dirty word in wider circles?
Well, first of all, it's very interesting you mentioned off being around the time of the nascent state of Israel. In the 50s, it was front page news when a member of the community visited Israel, and we actually used to run it on the front. Somebody had flown to Israel, and then when the first group went to Israel. So that was extremely interesting. And, you mentioned balance. Let's just bring this in at this stage. We've actually been accused of being anti-Zionist at times and anti-Semitic. And I remember a particular example of that in the 1980s when Rabbi Menachem Porosh, who was a member of the Knesset at the time, spoke at a UJIA event at the late Walter Hubert's home in St. Anne's. And I covered that event. And we ran a headline that week, that Friday, saying, from Menachem Porosh, middle-class Israelis struggling to buy food. On the Friday morning, we were accused of being anti-Zionist, and I got a hysterical call from the Jewish agency telling us, we were anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and that was because they felt that it would discourage people from making Aliyah. And the same day, of course, we got a call from UJIA thanking us for the front page coverage because it was going to encourage people to donate. So what you're mentioning balance, it's interesting, this comes under the hat of Zionism. We're very supportive of Israel, but that doesn't mean that we support everything that the Israeli government does. And we are critical at times, let's face it, we have to be, because we don't necessarily agree with everything that the Israeli Prime Minister might come up with. We have been quite supportive of Bibi. We're probably not in a position sometimes to criticize decisions that the state of Israel makes. And I think that's because we're not voters, we're not enfranchised to make those decisions and to criticize. We do criticize as far as we can from afar, and we're also very supportive from afar. Far be it from us to discourage people from donating funds to Israel or visiting Israel. And we're very, very supportive of Israeli tourism. It's not difficult to be an overtly Zionist newspaper because that's how it is. But then, the question I get is, well, if you're so pro-Zionist, why are you living still in the UK? Why have you not made Aliyah? And I have to say, well, I have a job here to do promoting Zionism and Aliyah. So I think that probably answers that question.
But this is one of the dichotomies, I suppose, of the diaspora communities, is that some of us feel it incumbent upon ourselves to stand up for Israel. When you look at the other, coming back the other way, and you say that you might not always be able to report on everything and over there, or to disagree with decisions that are made. But do you feel that over the years there's been any regard from the Israeli governments as to what the diaspora communities think of them and the work that's going on in the background on a daily basis by Zionist organizations? And particularly, I've got to say, the last 5 or 6 years, with the constant fight and battle during the Corbyn era to stand up for Israel, do you think they appreciate it?
No, not always, actually. I think there's some elements in the Israeli hierarchy of government, perhaps the World Zionist Organization, which do appreciate it. But on the whole, I mean, this is the old argument. This is a debate on its own about Hasbara, is public relations, which means that often their spokesmen in this country and in other diaspora countries really get the message wrong. They don't actually know how to respond always. I'm not sure they necessarily always appreciate what goes on. I think that some of the shalichim who come here, and by the shalichim, I even refer to the ambassadors. I think when an Israeli ambassador comes to London for the first time, I think he or she is always very, very surprised at the level of support for Israel that comes from the community. And I hope and think that probably does get transmitted back to the Israeli government, that people do back.
And do you feel that the ambassadors and the embassies show any love to the regional communities in the north, or are they busy sipping champagne in a socially distant manner in Tier 4 now?
I think in recent years, certainly in the last decade or less, Israeli ambassadors have prioritized visits to the regions, and I don't think we can complain about the number of times that they have visited. Unfortunately, it's not just the Israeli embassy, but other organizations which really should be serving the Jewish community nationally tend to be London-centric and do need reminding very, very often by us that there is life outside London.
There certainly is, and it's very vibrant. Adam, you've not had much of the limelight this evening, but I'm going to just turn to you because it's something Paul said earlier today, but also something that's echoed in a number of interviews that he's had recently, celebrating 70 years. Paul, by his own admission, is no spring chicken, although he's reliant on people like you to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on within the younger sections of the community. We could be forgiven for thinking that the Jewish Telegraph average readership can be of a certain sort of middle to late age, if you like. What work do you, and what challenges do you find yourself experiencing trying to engage with a younger audience?
I think I've got a slightly more different perspective on it, only because I've worked in the community before through UJA and other charities. It's a problem every Jewish organisation and charity has to connect with the younger audience. There are no young people's committees anymore from any Jewish charity. I don't know whether young people are necessarily interested in the community. They will read the paper at their parents' house or their grandparents' house. They will say they don't, but you can be sure that they will pick it up at their parents' house. Yeah, they will pick it up and they will read it. They know what's going on. They know what we're reporting on. And then I only know that because I'll get WhatsApps from friends going, "Oh, that was an interesting piece," or, didn't know that happened. Oh, where have you read that? At my parents. So I don't necessarily think actively trying to reach them anymore is worth the energy, because they're just not bothered about anything to do with the community, which is a community-wide problem as a whole. I got in trouble about 2 years ago. I went to a Board of Deputies meeting that was held in Manchester. And rather than reporting on it, I wrote an op-ed to say, what was the point of that? The community has zero... No, I'll flip that. The younger generation have zero interest in the community, the way it works, community politics and community organisations. But when that's what the majority of the Jewish media is about, it's difficult to get them interested in the paper. They're interested in it when it's about politics or when it's about Labour or football or that kind of thing. But in terms of the majority of what any Jewish newspaper reports on, they're not very interested in it. But that's what a community is. That's where the news comes from.
And it's easy to dismiss that as a generational thing. But it is, I mean, I know this from working with several organizations, that it is very difficult to engage with younger people, mostly because their lives are now dominated by work. So traditionally people used to work 9 till 5, they'd clock off, they'd go home. There was no way that work could reach them at home. Once they'd left the office, that was it. Now you can receive an email, a message wherever you are, and you have to be online and fully servicing people pretty much 24/7. The expectation, at least from the public, is there. And there's a feeling amongst younger people that they're far too busy to get involved with communal organizations.
David, you'll know with your shul hat on how difficult it is to get people involved in the shul. It's exactly the same with the newspaper. People have lives at the end of the day. The community, I don't know whether it's the word community or whether it's the word Jewish, but one of those two words makes them lose interest in it completely.
So when you ran your op-ed about that particular meeting, and I remember it well because when I read that, I hope I can still be classed as a younger person, whilst I've still got my hair. But when I read that, I thought, oh, well, thank God, at last the Telegraph is reporting on something that we've all felt and we've all seen. And the fact that so many of those deputies are of a certain generation, they cannot be truly representative of everybody. And there needs to be a concerted effort. And in many ways, what we've done at Shul and what we've done at other organizations is almost a form of affirmative action. You've had to give the roles to younger people to force them into taking care and to getting their hands dirty with it. And they do it. Some of them do a tremendous job. But there was major pushback against that op-ed that you did, and it sort of fizzled out, didn't it?
But yes, but then 2 years later, almost at the same time, I wrote one about the Manchester Rep Council. 2 years later, they still get maybe 10, 12 people at a meeting. And very often when Simon, who covers them, we read the report, we think, did anything really happen? Nothing seems to change in the community when it comes to young people. I've had the same thoughts since I was involved in Liverpool when I was 16. The community hasn't been able to adapt to young people. It's not young people who should adapt to the community. They will move on. They will carry on with life. The community, for as long as I can remember, has never changed, be it Manchester, be it Liverpool.
But this has never changed. The 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. For years, I can just give the example of the Representative House in Manchester. They tried to attract young people. Young people have never gone to meetings. Young people have never been involved in any of the major communal organisations at executive level or otherwise, and certainly the Representative Council. I mean, young people have never turned up at that. They've never found it relevant. So it's not even as if this is something new. It's not a generational thing. It's gone on for as long as I can remember.
And yet the Rep Council is, sorry, Paul, but yet the Rep Council is supposed to be representing us in the wider world.
I don't know how we are going to get good young leaders for the future if they're not involved. If we've got nobody involved in these organisations, it's the same people coming through time after time. I mean, you only have to look again at an organisation like the Rep Council. I can't remember. It's decades since there was any competition for the presidency, when there's actually been an election necessary. It's a question of who comes forward to take over, which really is not a satisfactory situation at all.
Yeah, no, I think the Rep Council and their efficacy, if you like, is currently being examined by. They were under review. And there are, from my point of view, sat here and looking at what's going on right now within the community, there are rumblings, and there seems to be a new collection of people. When I say new, it's a lot of the same faces. And that's good in as much as we still have people that are willing to pitch in. It's bad in as much as we need to be encouraging new people, because I think once you get new interaction, it challenges those old ideas, and it's really best practice to keep these things churning. And it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it's not really any sort of ageist stance whatsoever, because I believe that people of all generations have got an awful lot to contribute to their communities, and that organizations should be representative of a whole. But unfortunately, sometimes different organizations contain too many of the same people that are just filling up board seats for no particular reason. And I guess we'll all see how that plays out now. You have the new strategic group that has been put together, and that promises really community-wide collaboration from all sides of the community, both the ultra-Orthodox and also the more secular sides of things. But really, you'd be surprised if you sat in on one of those meetings, a lot of familiar faces.
But when you look at some of the charities in the community that are doing the biggest work, if you say the Fed, Maccabi, and High Cancer Care, look at the three people that are pushing that work. You've got Jilly Berens, who's under 40, I think. You've got Rafi, who's under 50, I think. It's Rafi.
I think he'll thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And you've got UJA, where you've got, again, Maccabi and UJA, it's actually kind of the same people. They're younger people pushing those charities and doing new things. They're independent of the Rep Council, of the Board of Deputies, and if any of these organisations that think they speak for the community and are stuck in that kind of thing that we've just talked about. So I think it would be time for those organisations to look at what the independent groups in the community are doing and learn from that.
Okay, we'll go before we go and answer some of the questions and look at some of the comments that have been made. Because this is really connected to what we've just said. The death of print journalism is a sentence that Paul will not want me to say out loud. And I know that having listened to you, I think you were on a panel together with a fellow from the Jewish News and other, and the Guardian was represented as well. So really mainstream organisations, and I think we all agreed after that print journalism was not dead, and that there was a readership. But you're under tremendous pressure, aren't you, from an online audience? The Guardian has long given away pretty much every single bit of its content for free. It carries a begging letter at the end of every single article online. But really, this is connected to our last comment, because our youth these days are used to logging online and receiving a great deal of content for free. To what extent are we concerned that if we don't make access to our news and resources as cheap and as accessible as possible to people, that they will go and rely on the hearsay that they're seeing on social media as their news barometer?
Right. Well, we first of all, because of our unique brand of journalism, they can't actually get what we give in print anywhere else. So people have to buy the paper for that reason, and that's not being arrogant. At the beginning of the pandemic, we received multiple requests for postal subscriptions because people were not going out to their newsagents. And very strangely, we actually increased circulation at that time. People were buying additional copies, 1, 2, or 3 sometimes in the same family. It was at that point that we launched our e-edition, and the e-edition is very, very cheap, and I'll get a plug in here. For £55 a year, you can get an exact replica of what you see in the Telegraph with the flip pages. You can see the pages exactly as they are. And not only do you get one edition, you get Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, and Glasgow edition for £55 a year at the moment, which is very, very cheap. So that gives people immediate access. And in fact, they can actually access that before the paper appears on the streets in the newsagents. Because what we produce, the content is unique and it's not available anywhere else. This is why we've been able to maintain our circulation, why people still buy the paper, because they literally cannot read this anywhere else. And as you rightly say, The Guardian is one of the papers which destroyed its own circulation. The Sunday Times, the Times did it at the very beginning. They just literally put everything online and then realized that people weren't buying the paper, and then decided to go behind a paywall, by which time people got fed up with the idea. The London Jewish media did exactly the same, putting all its, literally everything online, and still does. Why should people buy it? I mean, there's no need to do so if you're doing that. So many papers. Manchester Evening News is another one. Why buy it? You can read everything free online. It's a huge mistake. And if people can't get their information anywhere else, it's very different, perhaps, for a national newspaper where, as you say, with The Guardian are posting everything online, you can get so many versions of the same story. And electronic print media, media which are purely online and are not actually in print. So of course people can get that, but they cannot get what we give. They can't, because nobody else is producing it. Nobody else is printing it. Even the editor of the London Jewish Chronicle admitted, without realizing we had a reporter present, the Jewish Telegraph was much better at news gathering than it was. And that was in response to a criticism. We go to a hell of a lot of trouble to get stories that nobody else has, and the only way they can access them is print edition.
Well, there's a shameless plug for the e-edition, but warning to all viewers, it will not keep your chips as warm as the traditional version if you do want to make your way down to a newsagent. But I often wonder if children of my children's generation, anyway, if they know what a newsagent is, and if they know the value of the news and newspapers. And it worries me when we see politicians such as, the work that Trump has done over the last however many years it's been, 4 years, to discredit it really is. It's about the credibility of the press. And that worries me, because I think you've got a generation of people that do buy into that.
The media is trusted by those who read it on the whole. That's why they buy those papers. You mentioned the Daily Mail. There are particularly women who will swear by everything they read in that paper, particularly the health pages. But you've got reliable papers like the Daily Telegraph, which has maintained, it's even retained its broadsheet status. Most people don't read broadsheets, they find them hard to handle. The Daily Telegraph is a perfect example of a newspaper which I think is trusted by its readers, and people continue to buy. And I think the Times to some extent as well.
Let's have a look at some of the comments now that are coming in. Good evening to Mr. President Ian Michael Creek. Good evening, everyone. Do you have any plans to digitize your archive like the Jewish Chronicle did, and then you can make a charge for people to use it? Your 70-year history is basically a comprehensive 70-year history of Manchester Jewry, and it would be so useful to be able to search for articles. That's a great accolade, really, isn't it? That your reporting is an open history book.
It is, but to be quite honest, if somebody would like to subsidize that, at the moment, with things as they are, there's no hope of it. It's a very, very expensive process. We have 70 years of bound copies. Those copies are very, very difficult to digitize because of the way they have been kept. I mean, they're in they're actually bound. It's a huge, huge task and a very expensive task. We actually have the first 3 years of the paper on microfilm. Thereafter, we haven't. But if there is anybody who would like to sponsor that or subsidize that, we're open to suggestions.
Perhaps if there's anybody from the Jewish Museum out there listening that can get hold of a bit of National Lottery funding, that would be I would presume, in the public good and interest to really make those archives come to life. Robert Nathan, again, you've brought to us many interesting stories about Jewish communities throughout the world. Do you have a standout memory?
Well, I'm an accredited travel writer, so I've been very lucky to visit some extremely interesting places. I think the standout memory probably was I'm trying to remember. There are so many. Is probably well, I think probably the Yasser Arafat interview, because I was on holiday at the time and actually writing about Tunisia. So that probably has to be I suppose that's the standout. But I think the other one was on a visit to Taiwan. I was with a group of journalists. We were spending a week in Taiwan. On the Friday afternoon, I still hadn't found a good Jewish angle to my trip. And I was due to leave Taiwan on the Sunday. On the Friday, we checked into the Sheraton in Taipei. And I thought I was seeing things when I looked at the notice board there and saw details about a Friday night and a Shabbos service. I discovered that the charity Taipei had an integral shul, not just a room, but a properly equipped shul, which had been set up some years earlier by a businessman who spent a lot of his time, a rabbi businessman who spent much of his time in Taipei and needed somewhere to daven and got a minyan every Friday night. So I think that probably is my standout.
So, Adam, Paul gets to check into the Sheraton in Taiwan. You go to Radcliffe. Tell us, have you got any more local memories that sort of stand out for you? You've been with the Telegraph a while now, right? I mean, 5 years full time.
Yeah, 5 years full time, 2-year gap, and then about 6 years freelance before that. So, side note, to be fair, I have been on 2 trips. One was Salford, and the other was Auschwitz. So, not as great as Taiwan, but anyway.
No.
Yeah, one story. It wasn't really a story. It was a campaign we did, the defibrillator campaign, which I'd like to think everyone who's watching knows what that was. It was a story of the girl, a young girl whose life was saved by a young boy, both KD students, and it led to us looking at how much a defibrillator costed. And then realised that virtually no community building, never mind organisation, but just building in the community had a defibrillator. And by the time we'd finished at a very exhaustive campaign, there must have been about 100 to 150 new defibrillators bought for the entire community, in schools, in shuls, in shops, everywhere. So that's probably my highlight, and also something I'm really proud of as well.
Yeah, no, it's
how a newspaper can be a power for good, and that's how a campaign in a newspaper can actually help so greatly.
I think there's an awful lot that media and news sources. I mean, like I say, I think you guys are holding a lot of responsibility in your hands, and I hope that you continue to have the funding and also the courage to be able to call out certain things when you see it without fearing for not being able to survive the impact of that. But on that note, Clive Moss-Barclay, who's with us this evening, do you ever consider the impact your front page headlines will have on the non-Jewish world and their opinions of Jews?
Well, I don't know if Clive Moss-Barclay was listening in earlier when we actually covered this very topic. We think about it, but we want to eradicate this mystique about the Jewish community that we're not normal. Because we're normal and we have the same problems that every community has. We are very, very careful about the wording of our headlines. Not everybody will agree with it. As you know, I mentioned the headline a week last Friday, where we highlighted the fact that 75% of Jews in Britain had been adversely impacted by coronavirus. And I make no apologies for running that. We do think carefully about what people might think of the headlines. Not just people in the non-Jewish community, but people in the Jewish community. And we do have to be careful. It doesn't arise very often, but there are people sometimes who will disagree with the way we have highlighted something or headlined something.
Well, it's uncomfortable, but we very often hold ourselves to a higher moral standard, or at least we think we do. We're meant to be this light unto the nations in terms of innovation, but also moral backbone as well in terms of the decisions that we make and the way that we behave ourselves in public. But it's not always the case, and it can't be representative. And we are entirely like other communities, aren't we? We have the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, I would like to come in on something else that you just mentioned a few minutes ago about remaining independent and the financial impact. One of the bones of contention we have is with organizations within the community which think it is their right to demand free publicity. Now, we are here quite happily to write about what Jewish organizations do, report their events, and plug them where necessary. But what we have been expected more and more to do in the last 15 or 20 years is plug events in lieu of advertising. And this is very, very difficult because our only revenue is through advertising. We get a little bit for the sale of the paper, but very, very little indeed. And particularly when we see organizations spending money in London media at a much cheaper rate to advertise their events in Manchester because it's cheaper, and not spending it to, in their local Jewish newspaper. And this is very, very, very difficult. I mean, we had an example, and it was not in Manchester, it was in Leeds just a few years ago, where we devoted a full page to writing about an event for quite a well-known organization. And this appeared in our Leeds edition. Blow me, we see an advert appear in a local booklet in Manchester for that same event. The organizers then turned around to us and said, well, you wrote about it, you've plugged it to such an extent, we don't need to advertise. And unfortunately, this is becoming more and more prevalent, that we're expected to plug things free of charge in lieu of the advertising that we would normally have got. And this is the only way we get our revenue. The only way we will survive is through advertising. And this is through businesses as well as organizations, but particularly organizations. We need their support just as we support them.
Just to come in on it for a sec. For example, there was a conference 2-3 weeks ago, pretty major conference. The organizers had advertised in the Jewish Chronicle, and I sent one of the chairman of this organization a message and said, why not us? Like, the North exists outside of London. And they said, well, we just decided to advertise in London. We just thought everyone would pick it up from there. And I've been told since that actually there really wasn't a big uptake of people in the North watching that conference. And our coverage, I think, was dedicated to essentially a couple of paragraphs. So when people get the message that actually we exist, then maybe the community will be a bit more harmonious. We'll see.
But you'll see organisations like the London School of Jewish Studies have started to advertise quite a lot with us. They've realised that, and particularly because their events are now virtual, they're online, they're actually getting a huge uptake from the regions we cover. And it's the same with organisations actually in some of the regions like Glasgow and Leeds. which have suddenly realised, again, if they advertise throughout a lot of editions, they're actually getting a big uptake.
Right, we're going to have a look at just some of the other comments that have come in. I think this is not a question, it's more of a comment. Helena Rich, good evening. Helena, how are you doing? I'm a member of a large voluntary organisation, and we have the same problems recruiting members to step up and help run groups and to keep the organisation going. We have hundreds of volunteers, but groups will fold if members don't step up to run the groups. We also don't get new members under the age of about 65. And I remember actually that this really is indicative of some of the problems faced. More recently, you guys ran a campaign in conjunction with the Nikki Alliance Centre as well. Very much a similar argument. Some organisations would have said that the Nikki was failing to attract new members under a certain age group because it tended to be centered around one particular group of people. But it is a challenge, and I think that Helena, the only answer I have to that is that people are not going to come and volunteer willingly on their own. And there needs to be some very pushy people behind all of these organizations that are effectively twisting the arms of those younger people to step forward and until they start to get involved with it and they do feel that it's rewarding and they do feel they have something to contribute to the running of their communities. Michael Laura.
Can I suggest that Helena contact them? And if she contacts us, we'd be very happy to give some publicity to the fact that they need volunteers. Let's see if we can help. And by the way, we actually saved the Nikki. I think there's no doubt the Jewish Telegraph actually saved the Nikki with what we did earlier this year.
I've no doubt about that. Do you? There's an awful lot of power in that because you've got a story out there. I considered the Nikki had been very quietly taken behind the back of the bins and disposed of until you guys really shone a light on their funding and the fact that people wanted it to stay open. There's a great deal of power in that.
Just on that and on Helena's comment as well, because Helena, if I remember rightly, is League of Jewish Women. With the Nikki and from personal experience in Liverpool when there was Harold House was about to close, very often when things go in the paper to say this is going to close, people in the community suddenly realise, oh, actually, that's an important organisation, and I might not use that, but my parents use that or my grandparents use that, and that's what happened with the Nikki, and that's why it ended up being safe because actually people, while it may not, they themselves may not have used it, they suddenly realise that their family used it and how important it was to their family. And it's organisations like League of Jewish Women that the same things will happen. But I think with a lot of these organisations, it will have to get to that point where they're about to jump off a cliff edge that the community will suddenly turn around and say, maybe we should do something about this.
But because conversely, there are organisations which come to us and have done over the years, threatening that their organisations are going to close down unless, and I'm afraid it's very often a case of crying wolf, and it's not going to happen. So you really have to choose which ones are in dire straits and which ones are telling the truth. And with the Nikki, it was on the point of closing. And when we heard about this, we just couldn't let it happen. We knew that there was a need for it, and by giving it maximum publicity, the people who needed it really came forward.
So I've just had a private message from an individual that doesn't wish to be named, but the suggestion is that the Jewish Rep Council should be invited to come on next week to respond to certain comments. I just want to make an open invitation to anybody from the Jewish Rep Council, Board of Deputies, all of those organisations that have a lot of meetings to which most of us don't attend. If you want to come on this show and you want to talk about how you're engaging communities and how important you are to those communities, you're welcome anytime.
Just on something you just said, no one's disputing that they're not important, but you can't say that they're representative of the entire community when 12 people turn up to a meeting and nobody is under the age of 60. That's
No,
my last point.
I agree with that. This comment here from Michael is beautiful. I'm not British. I think Michael's originally from South Africa, but have lived in Manchester for 17 years. The JT has been a way of trying to understand the mindset and the quirkiness of the Manchester Jewish community, which still is worlds apart from my culture. I'm grateful for this content and the insight is a part of the Shabbos ritual. You are a part of people's Friday nights, one way or the other.
I'll make a comment which slightly sacrilegious, possibly. Many years ago, John Lennon caused Beatles memorabilia to be burnt and destroyed because he dared suggest that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. I often say, and I run the risk of being shot down here, in many homes, the Telegraph is almost as important as the Friday night candles. And we know this because people, strange as it may sound, are almost hysterical if their paper does not arrive on time. People just cannot cope without it unless it comes on a Friday morning. And they feel a great sense of loss if it's not there. So it's very much part of the Friday night ritual. I agree with our caller there.
I kind of cringe at that comment, but then I'm the one that gets the Facebook messages from people when the paper is delayed to be delivered to a newsagent. When they're saying, "Where is the paper? Why haven't we got it?" So it's not wrong.
It's something we all like to comment on. Drew Salisbury, what advice do you have for PRs when sourcing the best stories for the paper?
Keep it short, keep it relevant. Don't make it an obvious plug. If there's a good story involved with a picture, we will always look at it seriously and we always run it. What we won't run is gratuitous editorial for companies that are setting up. We get calls every day virtually from PRs or individuals saying, I've got a good story, such and such is setting up a company. It's a local Jewish boy and he's done very, very well. The simple question we ask there is, well, is he doing this free of charge? Is he providing the services free of charge? No, of course not. So we have to suggest that they might like to advertise that. And we will sometimes then plug it with advertorial that's marked as advertising puffery. But if it's a good story, and PR companies sometimes do come up with good stories, if it's a good story, we will run it.
Fantastic. So Ellie Pink, good evening, Rabbi Pink. Defribs was a great campaign. Who even knows the impact of that over the years? I think that was a really, really great thing that you guys did.
Well, an interesting comment on that was that were the few organizations who didn't take up the offer of these low-priced defibrillators. A couple of them actually turned around and said, we've never needed one. I mean, it's rather like saying, I've never had my house burnt down, so I don't need insurance.
Yeah, it's short-sightedness in the extreme. Robert Nathan, who likes to have the last word, but I'm going to have the last word in a minute. But Robert Nathan runs a Tuesday afternoon tea at 2 meeting, and it's been really, really successful. It has attracted people both from Shrubs, but also in the wider world as well. He's had people tuning in from America, from Israel. His guests have been, he's had a multitude of guests. He's got Alan Quinn, a local Sedgley councillor. He had Christian Wakeford last week. He's done some fantastic work. So I have to give a shout out to Robert there. We are very proud of our volunteers and the different activities that we've been running over lockdown. And Paul, the last question I'm going to ask you: how forgiving is the Manchester community? So we spoke about the Arafat debacle where people got upset. How quickly does it go away?
Immediately. Threats all the time that people are going to cancel the paper, they're not going to read it again. If that were the case, I'm not sure we'd have any circulation now. Not at all. It just doesn't happen. When we put the price of the paper up, we were told by people they weren't going to read it again, they weren't going to buy it again. That wasn't reflected in our circulation. So they are forgiving.
Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Thank you. You've kept over 40 people awake for over an hour and a half now, and they've stayed engaged the whole way through. Thank you for your comments. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you to Paul and to Adam for coming on. here's to another 70 years at the Telegraph, and keeping our local organisations, local politicians, and local news as honest as possible. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.